To start on another series of lessons here, never actually totally finished the last series because I always just kind of talk too much, I guess, as Jimmy says. But let me start off with just the question, and you don't have to answer this out loud, but just think about it. And some of you, this will be an easy question, and some of you, it'll be a harder question, maybe. What is the worst thing that has ever happened to you? Yeah, well, and I was about to say, and that's not something we really like to think about, right? We don't like to think about what's the worst thing that's ever happened to us. But we all have something, I'm sure, that comes to mind whenever we talk about that. Now, you can answer this one. What's out loud if you want to. What's the saddest story you've heard in the news recently?
I don't listen to the news.
Go ahead.
People dying from COVID.
Okay, yeah, several people dying from COVID. There's probably a lot of things out there that we could talk about.
There's a whole lot.
A lot of shootings. You've seen the conditions of some of the people being smuggled across the border. That's pretty heartbreaking, I think.
I think about all the missing kids.
Missing kids.
The number is.
I think that's associated to some degree there too. Yep. Mm-hmm. A lot of child abuse in different ways going on. Yep. So there's a lot of bad things that are happening out in our world, right? Is that new? No. Nothing new. As Solomon says, nothing new under the sun, right? It's happened for a long time. But anyway, most of us have experienced one of those days, where nothing goes right, everything seems to go wrong, just a bad day. Most of the time, those days don't leave any permanent scars. They're just bad days. But sometimes they are life-changing days. When you're young, the worst day of your life, if you asked me when I was in high school what was the worst day of my life, I might have said, like yesterday when I had a bad baseball game, or a day that your girlfriend broke up with you, or something like that. When you're younger, you may not have a whole lot of those bad days that really are of import. However, most of us in here probably thought of some pretty significant things when I asked that first question, right? And as Roxanne said, there's probably more than one that comes to mind when you think about that. I remember now then when I first thought of this, when I did this series that we're going to go into before, I think the worst thing that I remember having happened in my life was a morning when I think I was sleeping in. I think it was a Saturday morning, and so I was still in bed, but my mom answered the phone, and I heard her say, "Oh, Lois," in a tone, and I knew what that meant because Lois's husband, Jerry, who was my dad's best friend, had been fighting cancer for a long time. So I knew exactly what it meant whenever I heard that response on the phone, and that was a pretty bad day, some bad news. Of course, since then, I've had lots of other bad news, hearing that my dad had cancer and things like that. So there's been other things. So I'm sure, like I said, most of us in here have heard news like that multiple times in our life at this point. So anyway, we're going to be going into a book that talks about somebody that had a really bad day, and that would be the book of Job. Job pretty much loses everything in a single day, and Job had a lot. He was a rich guy back in that day. And so what happened to Job would be like getting, that phone call that says, such and such has happened, and then 10 minutes later getting another phone call, and then 10 minutes later getting another phone call, and it's like just back to back to back. these things happening one after another. So I think that it's a relevant study to talk about Job because as our congregation has suffered a lot of losses, a lot of illnesses, and a lot of things over the last few months, and I'm guessing most of you have noticed that Jimmy's lessons have been kind of tilting that way as far as how do you deal with that. And so I think that a study on the book of Job is very relevant to us. I mean, it's relevant at any time, but especially whenever you're going through some rough times, and we see what's happening. There's always, as I said, there's always been a lot of bad and suffering in our world. I think that we're sheltered in many ways, not from the personal struggles, but there's a lot, like we were talking about, there's a lot of abuse, there's a lot of people going hungry, there's a lot of things out there in the world that here in America we've been sheltered from quite a bit, or at least we don't see it in our face as much, though that is changing to some degree, that we're seeing more of it, but it just doesn't stand out as much to us, and so we're a little sheltered, and so I think that we've been becoming more aware of some of the things that are going on, and I think it is important to talk about those things. Also, one place that the existence of God has been attacked quite often is the problem of evil and suffering. The book of Job has a lot of information on that topic. So it kind of fits in with a Christian evidences type of discussion. Why would God allow these things to happen? And how can we answer somebody that has those kind of questions? What if we have those kind of questions? So I think it's important there as well. It falls right in line with giving us the knowledge to defend our faith in God, because it can help us to address that problem. And then also Job talks a lot about the providence and sovereignty of God and God's viewpoint on things. As I mentioned when we talked about this going into this series a couple of weeks ago, studying Job can be difficult. Most of us should be aware, have heard the story of Job, and we're familiar with Job, so we know what happened to Job, how he lost everything, and how he gets it back at the end, and we know that there's this discourse between God and the devil, and then Job's friends, and we know all of that, but for the most part, I think we don't go into a deep dive into all of the discussions that happen in Job, and that would be difficult because it's hard to do that. To me, it's kind of like going through and talking about the Psalms or the Proverbs. How do you how do you discuss that in a class setting? So I'm still kind of debating a little bit as to exactly how we're going to do that. But one thing we're not going to do for sure is go line by line and just talk about each line. We're not going to do that, but I'm not sure if we're going to just if I'm going to break it down and just kind of talk overarching for these speeches or what I'm going to do there yet. And that's okay because we got a couple weeks yet till we get to that, probably several weeks actually. Because my outline, the way we're going to talk about it, we'll talk about Job and just the setting of what happens, and then we're going to talk about good and evil and just why does evil exist? And that could take quite a while, especially if Charles gives me a bunch of tough questions. And of course, I like to ask questions and talk about what I think, but this topic is something that no human can claim to know exactly what the answers are. We don't know some of why things happen the way they do, or those kind of things. So don't get the impression that one of us ever thinks that we know it all or anything like that. We're just going to be discussing, what are some possibilities here? Why does it appear that God did this or does that? Why, those kind of things. Just why. A lot of whys, I guess. So that's kind of my plan for what we're going to try to do. So today, though, I'm going to do something that I usually don't do, and that is kind of teach. Not a lot of question and answers, just kind of talk a little bit about the background of Job and kind of what some scholars say about when it was written, who wrote it, those kind of things, just to kind of give us a foundation as we go into the discussion. So before I start, how many people in here have ever gone through an in-depth study of Job? A couple of you? Okay. So that means that you are the experts on it, right? So,
one thing for sure, if we start off reading this, we find out that it is a test.
it's a
Job's
test.
character thing, even though he disagreed with his friends.
Yep. Well, it is. The whole thing is a test of for Job, right? That is true. All right. So, just to give a little summary of what the book of Job is about, the simple outline of the book: chapters 1 and 2 would be considered a prologue to the speeches, like here's the setting for what's going to happen and for what they're talking about, and it's written in prose, which that's what all the scholars say. Prose just means it's not poetry or doesn't have any metrical structure. It's just regular writing. So then chapter 42 is the same way, and everything in between is poetry or metrical or some kind of dialogue or whatever. So everything in between is not prose. And that's important in only a couple of things, and that is that it does lead some scholars, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit, to say that there were two different writers of the book, which, once again, not too important except for in what some people would try to claim from that.
Because we know no poet could ever talk normally.
Right, yeah, if you write both styles, you can't do that, right? And in the first couple of chapters, we see that suffering is evil and that Satan is behind it. But there's more to it than just that, because we'll see that God allows it to happen, right? So that's going to be part of the discussion. Chapter 3, Job just basically, I don't know what word to use here, is crying. He's in despair in chapter 3. And suffering is a puzzle. Like, why is this happening? And then chapters 4 through 31 is where his three friends show up. And would you like to have friends like Job's friends?
No thanks.
Not so much, huh? So Job's friends show up, and they don't show up to encourage him so much as they do to discuss what did he do wrong, because why is all this happening to him, right?
Yeah, but in their mind, I think they think that they are comforting.
I don't know if I'd say they're comforting, but they're there to help him. They do think that they're there to help him, yeah. Yeah. They're not there to comfort him so much as they are to help him through his, like, you need to do something in order to get back to being in God's good grace. Yeah, I'm having trouble this morning. All right, and then chapters 32 through 37, a new person comes on the scene, and Elihu has several speeches in which he discusses the purposes of suffering and how it purifies and those kind of things. Then chapters 38 through 41, God comes in and speaks directly to Job. And so we learn a lot of things about God in these chapters, and what his providence is and his sovereignty and those things. And then, of course, like I already said, chapter 42 goes back, and beginning in verse 7, it goes back to what happened. after all this. So I do have, here's a question that we can get people's thoughts on. What are the main themes of the book of Job?
Would you like one of mine that's kind of antithetical to everything you just said?
Sure.
One of the things, in my opinion, is not about Job's suffering. It's about God using Job as an animal upon which to hammer the devil.
Yeah, it's about, yeah, I think one of the themes of I would say that more like God's sovereignty or those things. I think what we may not know what's going on because, well, first off, what is the main difference in what's actually happening and what Job's friends think is happening? They don't know the behind the scenes at all, right? They don't know that God and the devil have had this discussion, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. They don't know that the discussion's gone on at all. Plus, they have a totally distorted view of what actually is the case as far as why suffering happens. But that we'll talk about some more too. But they don't know any of that scene that we'll go into. They don't know anything about the discussion between God and the devil. So they're coming from a point of ignorance. They don't know any of this. So I do think we may not know why something's happening because we look at it from our point of view, and we'll get into that for sure. So yeah, I definitely think that's a main theme of Job. What else? Faith.
Faithfulness. He still trusted that God was in charge, and no matter what happened to him.
Job's faith. And then the other thing with that is, of course, what do we know Job as? The patience of Job, right? So, what's that? Perseverance, right? So that's certainly a theme, faith and perseverance. Still having trouble here.
Just a little, again, kind of a strange thought. It's not just perseverance, but Job knew he was right, and despite what everyone else said, he stuck to that. Now that's a perseverance, but that's not just perseverance of the accusation or through the trial. That's knowing your foundation,
Right.
staying with it despite what everyone else is doing.
Right, yeah, especially in today's culture where when somebody stands up for what happens often to an athlete, I won't name any names and I won't name any specific situations here, but when an athlete stands up and does something right, what often happens to that athlete or superstar or whatever?
Hammered.
Yeah, they get hammered, and then they usually issue some kind of an apology of some sort. Rather than sticking to their guns and saying, well, I'm not allowed to use that phrase either, am I? But rather than sticking to what they're saying and just explaining it some more, they'll often apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry if I offended somebody or whatever. They backtrack. So that is certainly of import to be able to, when you know you're right, as we've been talking about, it's important how we go about saying it. We got to do it in the right way, but we shouldn't back off of it. We don't want to back off of the truth simply because people don't like it. That's very important. What else?
I was just going to say that Job had perseverance with confidence.
With confidence, yep.
Knowing that
What else? What other themes do we see?
He stayed the course just because he knew.
Stay in the course, yep.
Till the end.
All right, so here's how I said some of the things. I think I'm basically repeating what you've already said, but maybe in a different way. So from one point of view, the book of Job is all about suffering. From one point of view. Why is there suffering? What is the cause of suffering? Why do the righteous suffer? All those kind of things. However, I don't think that's the main focus of the book. And as Charles was saying, it's not really about why suffering happens. It's more about how we should act toward God when suffering happens. Job's more practical than theoretical, from at least if you're looking at it from that way. It's like a first aid manual. The first aid manual doesn't really go into great detail about ways that someone might break their arm. Like it doesn't say, well, this, you could fall off a cliff and break your arm, or you could do this, or, all the different ways it could happen. It discusses how you treat a broken arm. So the book of Job doesn't tell us all the different reasons that God allows us to suffer, but he explains how we should respond to God when we are suffering, at least to some degree. Job gives us insight into how God is in control of everything in the world, the sovereignty of God. And one of the biggest themes in the book is trusting in God, as you guys were saying. Knowing that God is in charge and can take care of us. And now, what I like to emphasize on that is, because this is where it can get confusing, especially if we don't have the right point of view. That God will take care of us does not mean, once again, that we are going to have it all good, or that bad things aren't going to happen to us. What are the certainties of life? If we live long enough, we know that we're going to lose people. We know that we're going to see suffering around us. We know people are going to get sick. And we know that, and this isn't if we're going to live long enough, but we know we're going to die. Like those are the certainties of what's going to happen. Like we know those things are going to happen. So it doesn't, God taking care of us does not mean that we're not going to deal with problems. It means that we know where the end result is. We have the spiritual blessings through Christ because Christ came and died. So we know where we're going to go, and we have that hope. So that's really where I focus in on it, more so than do we get material blessings while we're here on earth? In some instances, at least. I think so. Will we get blessed more for doing right? In some instances, I think so. But that's not the main thing. That's not where the real thing is at. All right, and I do have another question. I guess I did have more questions than I thought. All right, so what do we know about Job? Like who was he? He was rich.
Owned a lot of livestock, had lots of property.
Yep. Yeah. How was somebody rich in Job's day? Which this will go again to when did Job live?
Land, animals, property, land, and children.
Children. And servants. Right? Talks about servants. So property, livestock, children, servants. That's how wealth was determined in those days. So he was rich. What else?
He was blessed.
Blessed.
Yep. It took Satan to come and take care of it.
Yeah. What else?
He was faithful.
He was faithful. Faithful to who? To God. Yeah. He was righteous, right?
Yes.
And he wasn't affected by his fault.
Right. Yeah. He still served God. He didn't get arrogant or prideful because of his wealth. Which, do you know anybody like that today? I do. I know people who are like that. That are wealthy, that are very humble and
Bill Riggs,
yeah. I've known several people. So yeah, that they do exist. It's just not, as the Bible warns us, it's not. Yeah, it's not easy for somebody to be wealthy and be that way. What else do we know about him? Where did he live?
land of pretzels.
The land of pretzels. Uz. In the land of Uz, yes, Uz. We know that he lost almost all that he had in a single day, right? And we know that he was being tested and passed the test. And then that goes back to the blessings. He ended up with more at the end than what he started with. Does that say that there again, does that go to the prosperity gospel that we're going to be blessed?
Use that, but that's not.
No, that's not what that says at all. In fact, you can argue in this case just simply, if God holds you up as a trophy, like this is my servant and I want you to see him, and then allows all this testing to go on, specifically, that to me is why God rewarded him. But it was like, you know, as he did anyway, because he specifically allowed all this to happen, so he specifically said, now you're going to get it back.
Yeah, but, you know, see, he got more stuff, that's true. But just from my thinking, the loss of all your children.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, you can't get that back. Yeah,
There's
no.
not enough money.
Right, no, but he was rewarded because of the specificity of what happened, I think, yeah.
His righteousness and God.
Right,
Fucking blessed him. God had been blessing him and wanted to keep blessing.
right, exactly, yep, I agree with that. All right, so we've covered some of what we know about the book of Job and Job himself. Let's talk a little bit about some things that are a little bit more iffy that we don't know exactly because we weren't there. There isn't 100% certainty, but most scholars seem to agree that Job probably lived in the desert lands of modern-day Arabia, somewhere east of the Jordan River. I don't have a map, and I can't even visualize it in my head, but we know where the Jordan River is, basically, so somewhere in that area. And they also agree that Job probably lived in the patriarchal age and would have lived close to the time of Abraham. Seems to be pretty much across the board. And we'll talk about some of that. However, there are many different theories as to when the book of Job was written and who wrote it. And some of those, like I said, do matter because of, well, the inspiration of the Bible. Some people would use the different authorship and different times and stuff to not attack so much as just dismiss the inspiration of the book itself. And if Job wasn't inspired or from God, and if it's not true, then there are other books in the Bible that are going to fall because there are other books that refer to Job. So that's of some import. Let's see. So as far as the author goes, some say it could be Job, which it could have been. Some say it could have been Elihu. That's the fourth person who shows up to have speeches in the book. According to Jewish tradition, Moses is the author, and I guess would have written it around the time that the books of the law were written. Some have suggested Solomon would be the author because it's similar to the books of wisdom and, you know, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. And then also Ezra has been mentioned as a possible author if you place the writing of the book after the Babylonian exile, later in time. In his study Bible, Charles Ryrie, who sometimes I agree with and sometimes I don't, states that the date of the events in the book and the date of the writing are two different matters. He states that most scholars seem to agree that the events took place during the patriarchal age around the time of Abraham, and there are several reasons for this, like what we were talking about. Job lived 140 years after the events of the first two chapters of the book, so that would seem to coincide with how long Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived in that time. The economy of Job's day measured wealth in terms of livestock, like what we talked about. Like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Job was the priest of his family.
I have a question. How old was Job when this took place?
I'm not sure exactly how old he was in it. He had 10 children.
So he had to be older than 10.
Yeah. So, yeah. you would hope. Yeah, they did. I mean, yeah, it's possible if yeah, depending on how quickly they had children and all that. But yeah, so he he would have at least been that old at that point. Yeah. And his children are adults too, by the way. So, yeah. So, 26, yeah. He's probably 50s. I mean, something like that. I mean, I don't know exactly, but just based on him having 10 adult children, yep. Yeah. His faith was mature at least. So, yeah. And the other thing here on the timeline is that the book makes no mention of Israel or the law. So the events are seemingly occurring before that period of time. But there are three different views about the date of the writing of the book. One is that it happened in the patriarchal age, like around the time that it happened. One is that it was Solomon, of course, and when the wisdom literature was being written. And the other one is in the time of exile, like we said, with Ezra being the author or something like that. Now then, as I mentioned, I have a lot. I did a little research back when I first did this lesson, and I got like pages here that I'm not going to go through of different theories. Like George Barton, he had a commentary like in 1910 that discusses the writing, and he links like Job to Isaiah because of the discussion of suffering and the comparisons between Job and Isaiah. He links it to Malachi because of the discussion of whether God rewards the righteous with prosperity and punishes evil, which I guess, is discussed some in Malachi there as well. But he's one of the ones that puts the theory out there like that the author for the prologue is different from the rest of the book, and that what does that lead to, or what kind of problems can that cause? Well, for one thing, as Charles mentioned, like it's just like you're saying you can't have the same person write in two different styles. Which why would you do that? Like why would that be the case? Why would you make that argument? I guess. That does happen a couple of times because we know like what Moses' death is talked about, and we know that Joshua, or at least I think I guess it's thought that Joshua finished, with the death of Moses in that book. But if you start attacking the authorship, it seems to me that you're, or trying to say it couldn't have happened this way or those kind of things. Like I said, you're kind of attacking the inspiration of the Bible, and that's okay. I mean, if you want to question it, I don't think that's a bad thing because you want to make sure that what we believe is true. But as far as some of those arguments just don't make sense to me as to why you'd even go down that road when there's no evidence to support it or no reason to think it. But they do say that it does play a role, the timing of when it's written does play a role as to how you view Job, like the events that occur and how you're looking at it. Because as we'll see, they had some very specific views as to what rewards were and what punishment was, and don't seem to have a full view of heaven and hell like what we do. Because when did that full view of heaven and hell come into place? It was when Jesus came and taught, and in the New Testament, that's when we get that full view. So there's some things there that are different because of just knowledge that we would have. Also, according to Sam Schultz in the Old Testament Speaks, the poetical books cannot be dated with certainty. He also states that the authorship is not of primary importance, which is true. Kings, prophets, philosophers, poets, common people are all represented among the contributors, many of whom remain anonymous. The books reflect problems, experiences, beliefs, philosophies, and attitudes of the Israelites. Notwithstanding differences in time, culture, and civilization, the basic ideas expressed by the writers in their interpretation of life are still vitally important to man everywhere. Now there again, that statement almost, that's a scholarly statement, like from an educational viewpoint, Like, these things are still applicable to people, not considering, is this from God or not? But he's saying that it doesn't really impact, the authorship doesn't really impact how you would look at what's in the book. So along those lines, I don't know if there could have been two different authors. Once again, it doesn't matter, like if somebody came along and had to write the story or whatever to give the setting of what all the discussion that was in the other was about. There's no evidence that it didn't come from God. That's the key.
I think for this is one big thing. If you're going to do a writing, you have to have a reason to do the writing. So if we run to Isaiah, there's no reason to do it, because Isaiah's covered a lot of the stuff in Job. So Job becomes, dare I say, worthless in the context of Isaiah, in the context of Ezra.
Right.
No purpose. Because everything, if you're talking about the nature of good and evil, etc., it's all covered. If you talk about Moses, now suddenly there's a purpose as you're founding a nation from a group of slaves, giving them origination, giving them motivation,
Right.
giving them perspective. So my opinion, and that's all it is who the author is extremely important. Also, to go with
Right.
later dating, most people didn't even remember the Sabaeans. They were long since gone by the time of Ezra. So,
Yeah, to me, now going into who actually wrote the book, like I said, we don't know. My opinion would be that it would be either somebody right there with Job at that time or Moses. Like that, those seem to be the ones that make the most sense, because otherwise you are coming back after the fact to discuss things that don't seem to be needed to be discussed anymore. Because you're headed into, well, you've already had the exile and you're heading into Jesus coming.
yeah.
I mean, so yeah, I think, to me, it seems like it's more one of those two earlier periods, and but if it were, it wouldn't matter if it, when I say it doesn't matter, it wouldn't matter if it were Elihu or Moses or what exactly there. Like, as long as God inspired the person and used the person, that would be what would be important there.
One commentary I'm looking at, I think it's the oldest book in the Bible.
That would be the case if it was written at the same time that the events happened. Because Moses wrote the books of the law when Israel, was being formed. And we think that the events take place before that, because there's no mention of Israel anywhere or of that. So if the book was written at the time the events happened, then it's definitely the earliest book or whatever, writing in the Bible.
Which would make me wonder who held it.
Who held it?
Yeah, when you go from the time of Abraham to the time of Moses. When Moses comes along, they're like, keep these things, write them down and keep them.
Right.
And Israel does a really good job of that, as the Dead Sea Scrolls well point out.
Right. Yeah.
So,
It was definitely kept for us, for sure.
yeah, so from the time of, if Job is in the Arabian Peninsula, which I tend to agree based on where the Sabaeans came from, so if that's the case, who's been keeping that up until the time of Moses? You're talking a couple of 100 years there.
Yep, for sure.
Like 500 years.
Yeah. So, okay, and I don't know where the bell is, and we're past where I should have rung it, but so that's it for today. Just in closing, like I said, I think that the questioning of the author is a way of questioning the inspiration of it, and that's the important part that we need to be aware of. And it seems more likely to me that it was one author, that it was in that earlier period. The book gives a progression of how, and what the book does is it gives a progression of how someone deals with pain and suffering. From numbness to anger to questioning to acceptance. And so we'll kind of discuss that as we go here. All right, thanks for your comments.